Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the third office hours for the Reactor Cloud Skills Challenge. If you haven't joined us for one of the office hours yet, how it's going to go is Dan and Ryan will be joining us momentarily. They are going to go over a brief presentation about some of the things that you are probably seeing in the learning paths and modules that you are going through as part of the challenge right now. Please feel free to ask questions along the way, either about any of the learning paths, DevOps, or the sampler pack, or about the presentation itself. You can ask questions using the live event Q&A. It's the 2 text box icon, and the top text box has a question mark in it. We will publish your questions and then either be answering them in the Q&A box or reading the questions out loud and answering them out loud. So please feel free to use that, ask a lot of questions, and we're excited to have you here today. I will be sharing some links in the live Q&A as well, the links to register for both of the Cloud Skills challenges that we have in case you haven't registered yet, as well as a link to the Microsoft Reactor YouTube page where you'll be able to find this recording, as well as the recording of the 2 previous office hours and kickoff event that we had. So I will now hand it over to Dan and Ryan. And again, thank you so much for being with us today.
All right, thank you, Deanna. So I'm going to go ahead, share out my screen. Okay, so thanks everyone for joining today. My name is Dan Gartner. I'm a Azure App Dev Specialist. I've been with Microsoft for about 13 years now, working in the field, focused on Azure, and the last 7 or 8 have been really focused on helping our customers move and migrate applications to the cloud. Today's topic for AZ400, we're going to hit on the section around developing a security and compliance plan. And I think that this is a super important topic, right? More and more of our customers are trying to shift security to the left of the pipeline. Really, we don't want to have security be an afterthought. We don't want security to be something that at the last minute, something that we review. And so there's lots of things that you can do in DevOps. There's lots of things that you could do with cloud technologies to automate those processes. And we're going to talk about that today. And then we also have Ryan Berry on the phone. I don't know, Ryan, do you want to give a quick introduction of yourself before we hit on the topics?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a cloud solution architect, so I work with enterprise customers all across the U.S., primarily in the application development and infrastructure spaces of Azure. I get to see a lot of the cool projects that our customers are doing and how they're using the cloud, and also to help them use tools such as Azure DevOps to be able to help facilitate their success in building and deploying applications. So I've been here at Microsoft for about 14-ish years, and I've been a CSA for the past 4 or 5 years. So happy to be here today.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, we've been around just about the same amount of time, right?
That's right. Yeah.
All right. So here are the topics, folks. This is what they're gonna test you on when you do take the exam, and I like how they break this all out crisply. We both took the exam, Ryan and I. I took it, I think, a year or so ago, maybe a little less, but it's a good one. It was a good exam. Learned a lot from studying for it. The 4 different sections that we're going to hit on today: 1, design and authentication and authorization strategy. So that's going to be around Active Directory, service principals, groups, permissions, how to kind of segment things, how to secure resources in Azure. Those are the topics that they want to make sure that you understand in that section. We're going to talk about maybe a little bit, maybe not a ton, on the sensitive information management strategy. So things like, where do I put my secrets? I don't want to check credentials into version control. I don't want to have connection strings checked in. How do I swap those out at deploy time using technologies like Key Vault secrets, GitHub secrets? There's pipeline secrets. We'll talk about that a little bit, and then we're going to hit on security and compliance. So when I talked about shifting left, a lot of this comes into play there. So automatically scanning your code base to make sure that you're not introducing vulnerabilities to kind of shorten that cycle time is, a critical aspect in modern DevOps. And we're going to talk about how you can do that with pipelines. There's a bunch of different technologies out there. You'll see here, if you go to the exam website, there's going to be a link to download the topics on the exam. They actually just put a note out there that says, all right, on November 24th, we're going to have a new exam with slightly different topics. And these are the new things that we're going to cover on the new exam post November 24th. So we will talk about a bit, GitHub code scanning, just so everyone has an understanding of that. I'll show you SonarQube, or at least speak to it a bit. Make sure you know what dependibot is and what it's used for, so you can answer those questions as well. We're going to talk about container scanning, and then I think we'll wrap it up around more of a general kind of governance discussion with the cloud. What are the tools that you can use in Azure to lock down your environments? And those are things like Azure Policy, Azure Security Center, and that sort of stuff. We're also going to talk about container registry. So I just wanted to give kind of that high-level overview of the pieces that we're going to talk about. As we mentioned earlier, just please ask questions if anything comes up.
Yeah, there's a lot of material, and we can't go do a deep dive on it all, but hopefully we'll cover enough at a high level to maybe inspire some questions.
That first piece that we want to make sure everyone has an understanding of is, how do we do, role-based access control, identity and access management in the cloud? So Azure, right? We organize things in Azure through different subscriptions, and subscriptions can be then subdivided into resource groups, and resource groups contain different resources that you need to deploy your application. You can apply identity and access control. You can apply role-based access control at any one of those levels. And so it's just important to understand the different ways that you can manage groups and permissions in Azure. And there's a few ways to do it. If you're an enterprise, you probably have something called Azure Active Directory, right? And Azure Active Directory has this concept of a tenant. The tenant is where the identities for your organization live. And one of the first things that you do when you stand up an Azure subscription is you basically back your Azure environment behind Azure Active Directory, and you use Azure Active Directory to authenticate, to log in, and to manage your users. And so, we just want you to understand Azure Active Directory is kind of that primary means for managing users and groups. And you can create groups and flow your groups to the Azure portal to manage who has access to subscriptions, resource groups, and individual resources. There's also different permissions in Azure. The most common being, if you go into the portal and you click on Identity and Access Management, you'll be able to see there's a ton of different roles and permission levels. But there's contributors, owners, readers, and then there's a ton of different other roles there. But the idea behind this, the takeaway is, it's important to manage your subscriptions with this least privilege mindset, to give folks only access to those things that they truly need access to. And that can mean having a subscription just for the developers, or maybe a resource group just for the developers, and giving them fine-grained permissions and controls to that.
And a twist on this, just as something that I think that DevOps and GitHub both bring to the table, is severing access perhaps to production resources and only allowing things to be deployed through pipelines or actions, and using an identity, a controlled identity. So the idea being you can have your flow of resources through a dev pipeline, and when it's approved to be released in a production, you can have the DevOps tooling be the sentient being with the and maybe perhaps the only person or thing with the actual permissions to your production environment. So you can think of that as well, not just individual people, but the tools and processes.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ryan. And would you say you're seeing more and more customers kind of implementing it that way, totally locking down the Azure portal and using the service principal in Azure DevOps to manage access?
Yes, I'm starting to see that more and more where the customers still have a break glass way to get access to that environment if needed. Obviously, there could be extenuating circumstances where that's required, but controlling that does a lot of things. It introduces the element of repeatability with using your DevOps process as the vehicle, the approved and sanctioned vehicle to deploy things into production. So then it's always done the same way, and the configuration files or the application or all of those other infrastructure elements are configured in a consistent manner, consistent, repeatable manner.
Awesome. So very, very good. So, just from a permission perspective for the exam, RBAC, role-based access control, maybe if we have time, we'll walk in a demo, we'll show you some permissions and groups and that sort of stuff in a bit, but there's a lot to cover. So I also want to hit on, there's a section, or there may be a section in your exam, I do remember a few questions on this, about conditional access and MFA in Azure Active Directory. So conditional access is really powerful. I'll give you an example. Say I'm using Azure DevOps and all of my code is in there, and I don't want anyone who is not on my company's network to be able to log in to Azure DevOps. I don't want, impossible traffic. Somebody 1 minute logging in from Chicago and then 10 seconds later, logging in from Australia. I want that sort of stuff to be blocked. I don't want people from a mobile device to be able to log in via Azure Active Directory. Those are all conditions, okay? And so with Azure Active Directory, you can specify these things called a conditional access policy that let you apply, even additional, access rules on top of who can access your applications. Okay, and so I remember this coming up maybe at least as one question in the exam, but just understand that conditional access is out there and it's got a lot of horsepower for adding additional controls to constrain who can actually log into your application. The most common use I see is the IP range conditions, right? So I only want folks from a certain geography or from a certain IP range to be able to actually log into the app. So even if they have your password, even if MF multi-factor works, they won't be able to log in if they're violating this conditional access policy. So that's another level of protection that you can put in front of your cloud resources, in front of anything that you're protecting with Azure Active Directory.
And there's some intelligence behind this too that I personally experienced, and I had back when we could actually travel places, went to Europe, and it actually learned that I typically log in from North American locations, and when it suddenly saw me try to check my email from France, I was prompted with a multi-factor authentication request. So conditional access policies can be employed in that way too, to make it seamless for users to touch things when they're doing it in a normal compliant way. But then when you deviate outside of that compliant way, you can have things like MFA come into play to be able to say, are you really who you say you are?
Yep. Awesome. So that's conditional access, a good key point to be aware of. The next point to be aware of is PIM. That's Privileged Identity Management. This is, you don't say somebody needs access to a particular environment in Azure. So you go in there and you give them contributor, and then they can access the resources. But you forget to take the permissions away, right? And they have these standing permissions. You want to avoid those types of things, right? You want to just have people to have a minimum set of permissions. You want them to have just-in-time permissions only for the amount of time that they absolutely need it, and so on. And so privileged identity management is the technology, is the capability of Azure Active Directory that lets you enable that. It's also got some workflow capabilities in there. People can request access to certain resources too, but I do remember this being another question on the exam as well, just around, I don't want people to have standing access to certain resources. So what is the technology in Azure Active Directory that we can use to give time-bound, constrained access to resources in Azure, and that's using privileged identity management. Ryan, do you have anything on this?
Yeah. So I can give. I was going to provide an example of a software vendor I work with who has some software in the financial services space, and they're heavily regulated, as one can imagine, in the financial services space. A lot of regulatory protocols they have to abide by. And what they do for every one of their deployments is they have individual subscriptions that they manage on behalf of their customers. And to be able to be in compliance, of some of the regulations they have to abide by, they're using privileged identity management to allow their operations team to gain access to customer subscriptions when they need it. So it kind of goes like this: customer makes a phone call into support. Support opens a ticket. That ticket actually unlocks access through PIM to be able to grant the engineer access to that customer's environment just for the duration needed to be able to fix something. So it can be used in some creative and flexible ways outside of just creating policies. You can actually build a solution around it with software you might be using, like ticketing systems and that sort of thing.
Awesome. All right, so that's PIM, right? So we're kind of covering Azure Active Directory, some of the more advanced Azure Active Directory services, and then also another piece that we want everyone to have an understanding of is this concept of managed identity. This is a scenario where you can actually think of it as like a proxy identity. I want this application to operate under this run as account, under this account, and I'm going to give that account these specific permissions that have access to this storage account, this SQL database, and those sorts of things. Instead of doing kind of fine-grained management of the permissions that this VM or app service can talk to this service or that service, managed identity gives you a way to apply an identity to individual Azure services, and then put the permissions on top of them and manage it that way. And so there's a bunch of different services in Azure. We should be able to share a link that support managed identity today, but think of it just from like a virtual machine perspective. I want this VM that's running my code to be able to access this storage account over here. Okay, in the early days before managed identity, I could have my application manage the keys to that storage account. And then if something happens, we have to rotate the keys, and it's kind of a pain. But also I want my application to be able to access this database. Okay, so now my application has to be aware of a connection string too, and credentials for a database. Managed identity reduces the need for having your individual applications to have to manage the credentials to each individual service that they're going to access. All right, so you can basically say, hey, any application running on this virtual machine, here's the identity. It has access to I'm going to actually put roles and permissions on it to give it access to these other resources, a database, a storage account, whatever. And you manage it that way instead of managing a bunch of individual keys, connection strings, and those sorts of things for your applications.
And because it is tightly bound to that object, in that object being a website, a virtual machine, when that object is deleted, the managed identity is also deleted. So to your earlier point, Dan, about eliminating extraneous access to an environment, you don't have just some random user object that still has permission to a database or permission to a storage account. When you delete the web application that needed that access, that identity goes away. So it makes it much easier to control access policies, and you don't need to worry about, as you mentioned, connection strings and where to protect those, how to inject those into your application, and that sort of thing.
Awesome. All right. So those are the identity pieces that we wanted to touch on. Next, we're going to dive into the Develop Security and Compliance section. Ryan, I'll let you kick this one off.
Sure, yeah. So one thing, and this is actually a quote from the former director of NSA and CIA that and goes along with what you were saying earlier, Dan, on shifting that dev SecOps or security operations more to the left into the process of the actual building of an application. So he has some very strong recommendations on assuming breach always. So that's inclusive of taking that concept or that mentality into account all the way back to when you're building and constructing an application. And if you go to the next slide, it'll take it a step farther. And this is actually some resources from Gartner where they've actually are highlighting some background on this called the DevSecOps philosophy on moving that introspection of from a security standpoint, or looking at your application with more of a security lens much earlier in the life cycle of building your application. Typically, or in the past, I should say, what I've seen is a customer deploys an application. They have a lot of monitoring and instrumentation that they wrap around that. Things like smart firewalls, web application firewalls, from various different vendors. Intrusion detection devices and so forth that organizations typically tend to wrap their application with. And not to say that that's bad, that's still, I think, a necessary entity, but you need to start thinking about how to protect things like, credentials, things like injection attacks, things like, are you using open source software that might have a very significant vulnerability that you've now deployed into production? And maybe the developer who decided to use that open source package is no longer with the organization, and you kind of lose sight of that. So you need to kind of think about backing the train up and introducing as part of your normal development processes to take security into account.
No, that's great, Ryan. And yeah, I mean, just to kind of confirm, I'm seeing more and more customers bake this into their CI pipelines, and it's getting really, I don't want to say easy, but with a few clicks, you can have a task in your pipeline that's doing code scanning, that's doing credential scanning. Right. You can hook up dependibot in GitHub, and we'll talk about that, to have it scan for vulnerabilities in libraries that you're using, and then actually automatically submit PRs, right, to fix that. Hey, here's the latest version that doesn't have the vulnerability. And so this used to be hard, right, to stitch all these tools together, to bake it into your process with DevOps, right, Azure DevOps or GitHub or whatever you're using. To be honest, the tools are out there, right? So really, there's no excuse to start moving this or baking this more into the development process, because you don't want to get the day before you're supposed to go to production, you don't get sign off from security, right? That's happened to lots of people before. We don't want that to happen anymore.
Right. So an example of this, and what you just mentioned on the previous slide. So when this is in the new world of cloud native development. It's oftentimes where customers are making heavy use of applications package as a container. So whether it's being deployed to Kubernetes or other services that allow you to deploy and using a container as a delivery vehicle. One thing that comes into play with that is that the container is based on some root underlying base image. That base image is some number of is based on an underlying operating system, whether it be Windows based or Linux based, and along with that comes some concerns around any vulnerabilities within that base image that you're using to deploy your application into, or to make sure that you don't have nefarious internal person that's deploying or injecting viruses or maybe some other malware into your container that ultimately gets deployed into production. So Qualys is actually one of the companies that has some tools to be able to help customers do some introspection into their containers. We make that available through our Azure Container Registry. That is our native service in Azure you can deploy containers into for storage. Via a checkbox, you can actually enable this container scanning with Qualys, and it will surface to you. This is an example of a container I have that's fairly old. That's actually highlighting that the Debian image actually has some some vulnerabilities that are associated with it.
Nice. And you know, just a couple points. I'm not sure if this will be on the exam or anything, but just know this: the container registry scanning, it takes between 2 and 5 minutes for the scan to execute, to run, right? Mm-hmm. And so this might not be something that you bake in to your CI pipeline, right? You don't want to wait 2 to 10 minutes, but maybe in a different sort of you know, release pipeline, deployed to a dev environment. And then wait 5 minutes. There's something called, you know, like post-deployment checks that you can validate whether or not new vulnerabilities have been introduced. So that's just a caveat that I wanted everyone to know. I'm bringing it up because it came up, you know, in a conversation with a customer of mine this week. It takes between typically 2 to 5 minutes for the scan once your image has been pushed or pulled to actually run. So I just wanted folks to know that too.
That's a good point. Yeah, because there is a disconnect. You have the process that builds the container, whether it be GitHub or DevOps. It uploads it to container registry, and then you have to have this process kicked off within the container registry. So that would explain the delay.
Yep. Okay. So that's container scanning, right? That's going to be a topic that's going to be hit on the exam. They've kind of bolded it in the sheet or in the list of topics. Other things that I wanted to touch on were code scanning, right? So you want to automatically check to validate that, you know, new vulnerabilities aren't being introduced into your code, or maybe you want to do credential scanning to make sure nobody checked in, you know, the SQL Server credentials or the storage account credentials, that kind of stuff. And so through Azure DevOps, there's a marketplace with many different extensions, and there's so many good code scanning companies out there. That will do this for you, right? They'll analyze your code base. They'll let you know when a new security vulnerability has been entered into your code base, and all you have to do really is just drop these tasks in there and configure them, right? So a lot of these companies maybe have a SaaS provider, and you would connect this to, you know, with your credential or a key to use their service. But here's an example using WhiteSource, which is a code scanning technology, a code scanning company, and this is how you would bake it into your DevOps pipeline. You could fail your release if a new vulnerability is detected, and you know, you get a nice report as well that's going to show you what's been scanned for, or what you know, libraries or code files do have the vulnerabilities. So that's one example.
Because we have an example. We'll show the report in the slide after the next one. So it's coming up.
Okay.
I just realized
I've got yeah. I've got SonarQube too. So we're gonna hit SonarQube. That's another one that just to be aware of. This might come up, but SonarQube is another. You know, it's a great code metrics. It does quality scanning. You can apply quality gates. It will rate your code base for the amount of code debt that you have, and it will calculate that based on the issues that it detects. And you can set a rule that says if we have more than X amount of code debt, fail the build, that kind of stuff. SonarQube is another code scanning tool out there that's very popular. So we wanted to just point that out. This is how you would introduce SonarQube into your pipeline. Going back to our prior point, back to WhiteSource, Ryan.
Yeah, a little out of order, so I apologize for that. But this is just open source software is commonly used in applications that I see my customers make or building, you know, either internal to organization or external. And one challenge with that, and I kind of alluded to this when I was talking about the DevSecOps, is that it's you know, the more of these that you use and take advantage of, the more challenging it becomes as vulnerabilities are introduced into these packages that your developer team might be using, that might be introducing security vulnerabilities subsequently into your software that you're not even aware of. And that's where products like, you know, from our partners like WhiteSource come into play. And this is actually a project that I have deployed into my one of my repositories in DevOps that I purposefully not touched in a while. And making use of a Node.js NuGet package. It's a .NET Core application. And you can see there's a number of vulnerabilities, and it's giving a ranking indicating these are actually pretty severe vulnerabilities that I need to upgrade the packages that my project is referencing. So sometimes this kind of goes along with the technical debt you just mentioned, that kind of have to keep an eye on this and make sure that you're moving forward and making use of the later packages, later versions of packages you have bundled in your application, that make sure that you're not being, you're not exposing your application unnecessarily, or maybe not even to your awareness. So this is a really powerful tool that I think is something that can be built into that DevOps pipeline, that when your application is built, it will do the scan for you and generate this report, and you can see it very clearly that what you need to update.
Awesome. That's great, Ryan. You really need to update this application.
Yeah.
Some major issues.
And one thing that I will highlight on this as well, that I just happen to think that their license risks is something that I didn't mention, but it is something actually I think is discussed on the exam as well, that there's different types of open source licenses. So maybe depending on if you're building commercial software, there's some restrictions to the types of open source licenses that you're allowed to include as part of your commercial product, unless you in turn make your commercial product open source. So this will actually take that into account to help you maintain a level of compliance. If you have a developer who goes rogue and decides to make use of some really cool open source library, but maybe is using a license that isn't compatible with how you're releasing your project, this will raise, surface that type of concern as well.
Oh, nice. That's something that people don't think a lot about, but if you're a software company or you're releasing something, that's critical. So yeah, glad that we're pointing that out. And then the next tool that we want folks to be aware of is dependibot. It does similar things to the tools that we talked about previously. It's going to look at your code base. It's specifically focusing on the dependencies that you're pulling in. But the difference is dependibot will look at your dependencies, analyze them, and if there's a vulnerability, it will actually send you a pull request to fix your code. The pull request will say something like, all right, you're on version 1.01, which has a vulnerability. You should upgrade to version 1.04, which has removed the vulnerability. And you can approve or reject, review them and merge them, validate the test pass, and then merge them into your code base. So dependibot is actually, proactively looking at the dependencies that have been introduced in your application, scanning them. If it detects a vulnerability, it's actually going to go one step further and try to fix them for you by updating to a known, clean version of a dependency and sending a pull request to you. So this is a piece of the dependibot is in GitHub. It used to be a independent company, but GitHub acquired them, and so now it's baked into GitHub. And so here's just an example of what a pull request would look like, right? And so here we've got this version 1.13.1 had a vulnerability. Dependibot detected that and said, hey, you should update to 1.16.1. Here's the pull request. It's going to give you, some decent information about it. And you can choose to accept that or not if all of your checks and tests pass. So really, really powerful stuff. This goes, I think, an extra step in that it's actually going to try to fix the vulnerabilities for you by updating the packages. So that's dependibot. So that was that section. The last section that we want to talk about before we open it up to questions is governance, enforcement mechanisms, those kinds of things. If you would have asked me, a few years ago, what controls there are in Azure to kind of institute governance, there wasn't a ton, but now we've got so many great capabilities. Azure Policy, really powerful capabilities. Azure Policy, Azure Security Center, the things that we talked about with Azure Active Directory, to assess your environment, to detect issues, to alert you of potential problems, to enable you to, kind of define like a blueprint and best practices and a landing zone for your developers to deploy in the cloud.
So why is this important? I mean, this is we're talking about things around a DevOps certification. So we mentioned numerous times about moving left when it comes to thinking about security, and that is also true when it comes to infrastructure used to house really any aspect of the development lifecycle, whether it be the developer's workstations or the access points that they're using to actually connect to to that environment. By access points, I mean not Wi-Fi access points, but maybe it's a personal laptop that a developer's using from home to be able to connect into something that and they pull down some source code. Maybe that machine doesn't have BitLocker encryption enabled on it, and just to provide some illustrative examples of how things can grow legs and walk off. We talked about access control and things like privileged identity management, or some of the multi-factor authentication mechanisms that exist. Those are really important to fundamentally secure repositories that has data, and that could be as simple as test data, but it could also be production data. We talked about like managed identities as a vehicle that you could employ to be able to only allow the application to have access to data. And then finally, another common or misconfiguration that causes vulnerabilities is where you have the infrastructure used to host your application misconfigured, and by that I mean maybe ports that are unnecessarily opened, making yourself prone to other attack vectors that maybe you weren't even aware of, not patching or maintaining your infrastructure. So these are all really important concepts to think about when you're building applications that are hosted in the cloud or in some production environment that maybe you're managing yourself. So how do we go about addressing some of that? And if you click the next slide. One of the resources that we provide in Azure to do that is something called Azure Policies. And what this allows you to do, and let me maybe best explain this with an example, that in a traditional IT world, you typically have some operations team that governs access to everything. You pick up the phone and call somebody and say, I want a server. And a couple weeks later, you get a server that somebody's racked and stacked and built out and secured according to whatever the company's policies are. The advent of cloud is intended to rapidly or introduce some agility to allow you to rapidly deploy applications into production, whether they be short-lived, maybe a marketing campaign or longer running applications. And one thing that I see a lot of customers do is take the same philosophy they've held on premises and try to extend and apply that in the cloud. And that just introduces impediments where you might have teams doing what I call shadow IT type operations. Getting an Azure subscription as an example themselves and deploying an application into it in an uncontrolled way. So that too is a bad situation that you want to avoid. So kind of the middle ground, from my point of view, is to put in some control policies into your Azure subscriptions, allowing your developers and teams that need to deploy stuff into the cloud to be able to do so and take advantage of the agility of the cloud, but also put some some guardrails in place to be able to make sure they're not doing something that's against your established governing policies. So like deploying a SQL server with a public IP address, or deploying a virtual machine maybe with a public IP address. These are examples of some of the types of policies that you can layer in and have the subscription manage itself. So if somebody tries to do one of those things, it'll put the brakes on it and inhibit them from doing that. And you can actually apply these policies across your entire organization, or in what this picture is showing is a concept called management groups. which is a powerful capability in Azure where you can take a bunch of subscriptions and say, these are my development subscriptions, these are my production subscriptions, maybe these are subscriptions that my core IT assets live in. And you can have different policies across all of those different groups of subscriptions. So maybe it would be more relaxed in a development environment and much more rigid and strict in the production environments that my applications are deployed into. So this is a way to be able to provide some controls without stifling innovation.
Excellent.
And we do have one question in the chat. Anonymous asked, would it be cheaper for enterprises to implement zero trust instead of adding so many layers of security?
So that, I mean, my approach to what I talk to customers about is taking a least privileged approach to access control. I don't really know that there'd be a significant cost benefit there, but let me take into account like an application. So, using a combination of access control policies, and the Azure subscription policies to be able to restrict what can be done with regards to resources deployed into production, in combination with things like a managed identity to be able to not have a human being who has access to maybe the storage account that your application is reading and writing to, but only allow the application and the application itself be the entity that has permission to read and write to that storage account. So, we have a lot of guardrails in place that makes it easy to deploy and control and govern applications without having to worry about locking down connection strings and maintaining passwords and certificates. So we have some things that you can, those still exist and can be used. But I think that if you back up a little bit and look at it at a more macro level, there's a lot of capabilities that exist to be able to make it easier to employ some control around those types of applications. So I wouldn't necessarily call this a lot of layers of security, but these are governing instruments that you can toggle on to be able to help with that. And hopefully that answers your question. And if not, maybe provide a little bit more clarity about what you're inquiring about.
Okay. And then I think this is our last slide, Ryan.
Yep. This is so what this is actually showing is across all of Azure that these are tools that we have within Azure, within our capabilities in Azure to examine at that macro level what types of things are permitted within your subscriptions or resources that you've deployed, and then also when it comes to features and functions we have in Azure to be able to control and review whether or not you're abiding by these access policies. So we have on the right-hand side, like Azure Security Center and Azure Monitor. These are features that you can use to be able to monitor across your entire subscription or enterprise whether or not there's any policies that you put in place that are being violated, as an example. And likewise in the case of a storage account, just kind of using that as an example, encrypt paths, storage, and databases, kind of go across the matrix there. Azure Key Vault can be used to actually store, store your own key that you're using to encrypt your storage accounts or your Azure SQL databases. So, this is kind of a matrix of all of the options we have available and how they apply to different environments in Azure. Kind of a good lead behind.
All right. So that concludes our presentation.
Perfect. We have another question that came in, and this might be this might go along with the question that was asked before, but it says, InfoSec will love centralized security for review. Are there single pane of dashboard to facilitate these governance?
There is. So our solution to that in Azure is something called Azure Security Center. So we showed like the Qualys container scans. So let's say you have a whole bunch of container registries across many subscriptions. That detail can roll up into an Azure, into the Azure Security Center. So that can be the pane of glass into what sort of container violations or vulnerabilities you have across your entire organization or enterprise. We mentioned policies. Policies can be configured to block things, like my example about blocking you from creating a virtual machine with a public IP address. But they can also do something that's called you can create what's called an audit policy. So it's a policy, it doesn't necessarily block something, but surfaces it to the info security team to be able to say, okay, somebody did something that they shouldn't have. It was allowed to occur, but now there's a record of that. So those are also surfaced in the security center. And what Dan's showing here as well is that we have some features where you can actually institute checks or policies, like maybe you have an e-commerce site that needs to abide by PCI compliance. This will actually go through and validate, whether or not you're adhering to some of these regulatory compliances that are fairly challenging and strict to guidelines to obtain and achieve. And this will help you in kind of getting at a glance dashboard view of that.
My environment's not doing great. 336 unhealthy, 30 healthy. But yeah, this is that single pane of glass. And then you can, of course, click in and drill into this. You can define your alerts. So what are the things that we truly care about and get alerted on them? There's some insights over here. So hey, yeah, I've got 110 storage accounts. I've got a lot of stuff in Azure. And it's saying, hey, here's things that you can increase your security score if you do these. Secure management ports, remediate these vulnerabilities, and I can click on those, and it will tell me what things I need to do to remediate those issues. But yeah, this is that pane of glass to monitor everything in Azure. We have several single panes of glass. Another one is cost management to manage your costs. You can drill into policy to look at just the policy section here. But yeah, I did want to show this to everyone. Azure Security Center.
Good question. And if you think, there are lots of tools that the info security teams typically use, and including SIEMs. There's a lot of tools in that market, whether it be QRadar and others. So we have something called Azure Sentinel that can actually take all of this data and actually, feed it up into a vulnerability, kind of a machine learning-based vulnerability detection engine. So that that's taking this data up a little bit farther to be able to do things like looking at traffic patterns into virtual machines that might have public IP addresses, and raising concerns if all of a sudden you see traffic from Asia or Russia or continents maybe that traffic doesn't typically originate from. In addition to being able to take on-premises log data and being able to ingest that, as well as Office 365 log data and being able to look at that. So.
Thank you. We don't have any questions at the moment, but we should give it a little bit and see if any more come in. If anyone does have questions about what we've gone over today or anything within the DevOps module, please let us know. Tom, I did see your question about updating your registration, and I have reached out to try to find an answer for that. So I will answer your question here shortly. But if anyone else has any questions, we'll hang out for a little bit and see if any more questions come in. Ryan or Dan, do you have any more tips on the exam or anything people should be aware of?
So I would say a couple things. The Microsoft Learn content is really awesome. So if you are, walking through that, I looked at it again today. and it's really good stuff. Also, if you just do a search for Azure DevOps Hands-on Labs, just do a search for that with your favorite search engine, and there's going to be some really good walkthroughs there. So I would recommend spending some time on those. Enabling continuous integration with pipelines. There's exercises for walking through Azure repos. There's some really relevant stuff to this exam. So take a look at that. It's just AzureDevOpsLabs.com, and go through some of the pipeline ones. Those are relevant to the exam. Anything related to pipelines, I think, will be helpful for folks.
Yeah, and then another thing, we talked very briefly on Azure Container Registry. It might be beneficial to have at least a cursory understanding of what containers are used for, and then also in the environments that are typically used to host containers, which the biggest and most common and prevalent one is Kubernetes, have some background understanding maybe of that hosting environment and ways you can deploy into that, in ways that you can leverage pipelines to deploy into that. So that would be another thing that'd be worth looking at.
Great. And then someone asked if we'll be able to share the slides out from the presentation. Is that something that we can include with the recording on YouTube?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Perfect. So I will share a link right now in the chat of the Reactor YouTube page. We should have this recording up with a link to the slides by tomorrow.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for your time today.
Yeah,
Perfect.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And please join us next week. We have one coming up on November 19th. It'll be at the same time, 1 p.m. Pacific time, 4 p.m. Eastern, and we hope to see you all there. And thank you, Ryan and Dan, for your time today.
No problem.
Anytime. We'll see you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.